Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening in some cases, and welcome to today's ACGC session. My name is Karen Athanasio. I'm new to the ACGC community, having joined a little over a month ago as the Senior Manager, Member Relations and Partnerships, and it's a real pleasure to be part of this community, and I'm very much looking forward to getting to know everybody better. We are incredibly excited about today's session, not only because we have a panel of insightful and hugely experienced panelists and moderator, but also because of the overwhelming response we've had to today's session. It's clear that this is a topic that resonates with everybody. Today marks the first in a series of ESG-focused discussions that we will be hosting, and we're starting with a particularly thought-provoking theme: ESG on trial in Africa, navigating the backlash, facing the Greenlash. There will be interactive polls during the session. Please keep an eye out for those and respond and engage with them when they appear. Your feedback and opinions are important to this discussion. We'll also be taking your sessions in the chat throughout the session, and we will address them at the end. Please feel free to share your thoughts throughout. I've had the opportunity to join some of the preparation calls for today's discussion, and I can say with confidence that we are in for a thought-provoking time and a meaningful exchange. It also became clear to me that the very best way for the panelists and the moderator to be introduced was to let them do it themselves. So I'm going to hand over to them. Thank you again, everybody, for being here. Thank you to our speakers and our moderator. Let's get started. Amma, I'm going to hand directly over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Amma Ocansey. I am the Head of Diversity and Inclusion and a Corporate Finance Lawyer at BNP Paribas, and I'm really pleased to be with you here today. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce my fellow panelists, Adeola, Olumeyan, and Ted George. I will allow them to introduce themselves further soon. But firstly, I want to sort of discuss ESG, environmental, social, and governance. It's one of the most important areas of the 21st century. We are all familiar with its evolution and progress, the constant COP conferences. We're currently at number 30, the drive to net zero, especially in the West, the United Nations 17 Sustainable Goals, the rise in green financing. In fact, the African Development Bank issued a 750 million bond last year in order to fund environmental and social projects. So this area is ever evolving and ever prevalent. However, we're all aware of the risk as well and the challenges facing ESG. Flooding, global warming, climate change, the accusations of greenwashing, the human rights violations, and the ever-mounting litigation. And so the question is, as members of the continent and lawyers, we are there to support our clients in order to grow and thrive their businesses. But the reality is that as lawyers, we're also taught to manage risk, mitigation, litigation, and various challenges and see the bigger picture. So the question that we have to consider today is ESG a legal liability or a strategic opportunity? And in order to sort of explore this further and try and resolve these two competing factors, I'd like to welcome our panelists to present their cases. But before that, please could you introduce yourself? And we'll start with Adeola. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Amma. And hello, everyone. My name is Adeola Olumeyan, and I'm the Regional General Counsel and Head of Risk and Compliance at JA Africa. And today, my testimony will be to deliver critical legal testimony on litigation risk, compliance duties, our shifting regulatory landscape, and how even global exposure can amplify this for African organizations, whether you are a local SME, whether you support a local SME or a multinational or whether you are with a company that manufactures or a service provider. Thank you.
And Ted.
Hi there. Hi. Thank you very much, Anna. Hello, I'm Dr. Ted George. I'm the founder and chief narrative officer of Kleos Advisory, and thank you to the ACGC for inviting me to take part in this webinar. My background is I've been in advisory and research for a number of years. I used to be head of research at the Pan-African bank, EcoBank, so I've had a lot of involvement, particularly to do with commodity trade, and that is very much the lifeblood of African business, to do with exports and also to do with a lot of the value addition and employment in Africa, if we think of soft commodities and the amount of people who basically work in the agricultural sector or who depend on it. So today I'm going to be giving the economic angle on it, looking at some of the economic risks, some of the economic impacts, and also the crossover this has in terms of regulation, what it means. I'm sure it'll be crossing over with some of the stuff Adeola is talking about as well, and I look forward to getting into the meat of the discussion.
Thank you so much both. And actually, Ted, let's start with the economic case for ESG.
Excellent. Fine. Well, in which case, what I'll do, I'll just share my screen and I'll put up my presentation and let's have a look at this. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is start off by talking about what is the economic factors which are out there, what are the economic impacts of ESG, particularly in the African context, but also what are investor and regulator expectations. Things are changing. As you know, we're talking about ESG on trial at the moment. There's been a bit of a backlash against it, particularly led by the Trump administration and other parts of the world. But there's also been a counter Greenlash, if you like, particularly in the EU, doubling down and saying we're not giving up on this. So we really need to understand what the economic context of this is. And I think the important thing to understand when we look at ESG is that in the old days, everyone always sort of kind of separated it out. You had the environment, you had society, you had the economies, and they kind of crossed over a bit like a Venn diagram. But that's not really how it works. The reality is that the economies are embedded within society, which is embedded within the environment. That makes logical sense. There is no economic activity if there is no human society. You cannot have human society without the environment. We live within it. And so the reality is they are all intertwined, and any kind of impact you're talking about in social or environmental or governance terms has a financial impact. And in fact, so much about when we talk about sustainability, sustainable economy, sustainable development is about trying to understand the impact on the planet, about ensuring life essentials, and also understanding that all economic activity in some way has a negative impact. Some is more positive, some negative. We want to maximize the positives, minimize the negatives, and be well aware of what these impacts are. So what is driving all of this? Particularly when we talk about ESG, we mean sustainable finance. The first thing more than anything is regulation. This graph here shows the number of regulations there are out there about ESG issues from major regulators around the world. You can see around 2000 it started to rise. That's when we first got the Millennium Development Goals. But from 2015, with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, the Paris Accord, a lot of things that have come since then, it's absolutely skyrocketed. So the reality is compliance. That's one of the big issues which is driving sustainable finance and its importance. But also, we're finding investor demand is changing. You need to remember that maybe over half of the professionals in the world nowadays are millennials. And in fact, we're already seeing the first Gen Zs coming into the professional workforce. And when they were asked about investment, for example, 80% are either very interested or interested in sustainable investing. It matters to them in this point. Most of them have made an investment in something clearly marked as sustainable in the last year, and at least 3/4 believe they can influence things like climate change. So this is something which is now critically important. Investors are asking for it. And it's not just because we want to be good people. You get better returns with a sustainable investment. This is just one example from Morgan Stanley. What they were doing was tracking companies which are rated in terms of ESG terms. AAA, a leader, as green as you could get. CCC, a laggard, maybe not even aware of the negative impacts they have. When they tricked these indices during COVID, you can see at the May 2020, everything crashed down. But you can see over the period here of about 2.5 years that essentially the AAA investment essentially doubled in value, whereas the CCC had lost value by the end of it. It's not really surprising. If you are sustainable in environmental, social terms, you're also sustainable economically. You're going to be able to rely on a regular flow of goods. If you look after your workforce, they're going to be there to provide what you need for economic activity. So it's not just about being good. I think a lot of people are recognizing that in the medium to long term, a sustainable investment is a much better idea. And that's why we've seen enormous growth when it comes to green loans and sustainable linked loans, a whole series of bonds which are out there, green bonds, quite a few of them linked to renewable energy or preventing deforestation, and a whole series of ESG funds out there, equities and bonds as well. It's pretty hard to get an accurate estimate of the market, but we're probably talking over $2 trillion now in green or sustainable investments or places where you can put your money if you want to have an impact. And that's why in sustainable finance, it's an area I've been driven into, and all finance to a certain extent nowadays has to meet certain sustainability requirements. So how does actually ESG impact when we're looking at economically? Well, particularly if we're looking at Africa, Africa is very heavily commodity dependent. Commodities, if you take the top 15 exports from Africa, every single one of them is a commodity. And a lot of them actually involve agriculture, they involve mining. There are multiple impacts along the train. And so particularly when you're looking at Africa, you've got to think very carefully just how many impacts are you having? Because in each of the buckets, E, S, and G, there are impacts out there and they have economic impacts as well. So let me just give a few simple examples. First of all, if we think of environment, you've got droughts and wildfires. They're becoming much more common because of climate change. If you are involved in a business to do with cattle, to do with crops, if you have a major drought, you take somewhere like the Horn of Africa, they've had 12 successive seasons with either no rain or poor rains. You have the destruction of crops. But then, of course, we have deforestation, a major problem, particularly if you look at the cocoa sector. You take the example of Côte d'Ivoire. Every single one of the 87 protected forest areas has been severely damaged by deforestation for cash crops. And this has knock-on effects for the local population as well. And then, of course, we think of pollution of the oceans. You think of the plastic pollution. If you're involved in fishing, most Africans who live near the coast, nearly all of the protein they get is from fish. Well, not if they're being poisoned by plastic. And let's not even think about tourism. Who wants to go and swim in a sea like that? So on the environmental front, there's a lot of issues to take into account there. And then, of course, we have the overlooked bit of ESG, S, social impact. I know something very close to Emma's heart as well. Just to give two examples here. I work a lot in cocoa in West Africa. One of the big issues, of course, is child labor. This photograph is of a bunch of kids who were probably from Burkina Faso, who'd been trafficked into Côte d'Ivoire and were being made to work in terrible conditions, cutting cocoa pods there. This is one of the big issues to address, child labor and forced labor. But a bigger issue as well is what about the actual providing a living income for farmers? That photograph on the right is a picture I took when I was in Ghana at a cocoa village, which has existed for 70, 80 years. Where's all that wealth gone? None of it has gone to the farmer. This search for decent living conditions, paying farmers a fair wage, a living income, these are critical social factors as well. And any kind of commodity or any kind of trade or business you're involved in Africa, you need to be thinking about the social impacts. Ultimately, they all come together under governance, and we've seen multiple governance failures. To put it simply, ESG is about the governance of E and S risks. And there are multiple examples of where this goes wrong. This one I thought I'd bring up because it's so striking. I don't know how many of you out there have heard of UTZ. Probably no one. There are two very well-known sustainability labels. We have Fair Trade and we have the Rainforest Alliance. But there used to be a third, which was UTZ. It had a slightly more commercial model, but ultimately it was saying that they're not going to pay a premium UTZ. What they'll do is increase yields, increase sustainability, and that way farmers will make more income. But it was discovered in an audit after about 10 years of activity in West Africa that they were actually sourcing beans from farms which were in protected forest areas. And remember, UTZ was paying a premium to these farmers for being sustainable. But it wasn't just one or two farms. It was 4,900 farms that they were sourcing from. So you could say it was a total failure in governance. They were actually selling products to people saying this is sustainable. And in fact, they were incentivizing farmers to cut down forest because they were paying a premium for this. So this is the most extreme example, but the failure of governance is what leads to the most terrible environmental and social impacts. UTZ no longer exists. It's been swallowed up by Rainforest Alliance, and hopefully we've learned our lesson from that. But there are many examples of governance going wrong there, unfortunately. So what does this all mean in terms of Africa? Well, if we look broadly at what is the ESG landscape, there are still two central frameworks, which, if you like, are the benchmarks globally. On the left, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. The top row is very much about human society. The middle row is very much about the economy and economic activity. And the bottom row is very much about the environment and the planet. You could argue if these were done today, numbers 13, 14, and 15 would probably be at the top. But that is, if you like, the benchmark that everyone marks any of their ESG policy to. And then on the right, of course, we have the Paris Climate Agreement. Three central ideas there. One, we want to limit the warming of the planet to no more than 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial average by the end of the century. Spoiler alert, we're already at 1.53, so pretty worrying times. And also, we all should try and move to net zero by 2050. The second thing is we have to get more resilient, and we also have to accept there are some changes we cannot change. If water levels go up, let's say the sea by 3 or 4 meters, billions of people are going to have to move from where they currently live. And of course, we want to align all financing with this. Let's have climate financing, social financing, financing to protect forest, etc. Those are the big ideas. But there are quite a few other regulations out there. And I just want to finish off my opening comments by touching on a few of them because they're quite relevant to anyone doing business in Africa and to lawyers trying to work this one out. The first is the carbon tax the European Union has introduced. It's known as the Carbon Adjustment Border Mechanism, or CBAM, and initially it was just on very high carbon products. You think of things like steel, coal, oil. Pretty obvious, right? Initially, they didn't include agriculture because agriculture is one of the biggest employers, one of the biggest opportunities for economic development. But recently, the European Parliament has said they want to include chocolate, because chocolate is actually one of the highest carbon foods in the world. After meat, it's chocolate. Why? Because most chocolate consumed in the world is mixed with milk, and milk comes from cows, cattle, deforestation, methane emissions, etc. The thing is, no one has anticipated this. So if they were to introduce the CBAM for, let's say, cocoa exports and chocolate making in the European Union, it could be disastrous. This simple example here from Barry Callebaut, which is one of the largest chocolate producers in the world, if they were to pay carbon taxes at current rates and using current estimates for the carbon footprint of a chocolate bar, they would be paying between 380 and 840 million euros a year, which means to make chocolate in Europe, they would be making a loss of 300 million. In other words, they'd have to pay the European Union 300 million for the privilege of making chocolate in Europe and make zero money. In other words, huge losses. So this could totally upend their model. Now, of course, they're lobbying like crazy to stop this, but this is one of the examples you get of when they talk about the different kind of transitions out there. And these are very much, this is a long-term transition, not a physical transition, but a regulatory one. And quite suddenly, there is an economic model here which doesn't work. So CBAM is a big one to think of. Even more concerning is the European Union deforestation regulation in terms of its economic impact. EUDR was supposed to come in at the end of last year. They unsurprisingly delayed it. It's supposed to come in at the end of this year. And if you look at the graphic there, that's sort of how it's supposed to work. You get your production, the farmers deliver, this is an example of cocoa, they deliver their cocoa-free beans to cooperatives, it goes to a warehouse, it's segregated, and then when you get to 4, 5, and 6, that's when it enters, let's say, the European or the American market. Pretty simple. We have very sophisticated companies there. They can log all of this, and it's quite easy to work out what are things like, carbon footprint, and have you been tracing this properly. The real problem with this, of course, is 1, 2, and 3. There are so many blind spots out there. Very often, if you pick up a bar of cocoa or, let's say, a bag of coffee, how can you tell even where the coffee originally came from, how it was made? And so this is another big concern, EUDR, because there's no sign the EU wants to back down on this. And the ultimate sanction is you will not be allowed to export to Europe. End of story. And if you bear in mind that the EU handles around 40% of Africa's exports, that's a major, major concern. Any kind of business that you have which involves agriculture, and probably mining too as well, there's going to be deforestation in there. And so this is a big, big concern. How can we properly track that one as well? And then the other thing, which is a much bigger issue, and it certainly sits over the trade finance sector as well, are the efforts by the ICC to create principles for sustainable trade finance. After much wrangling, they finally officially launched it in Seville at the development conference there a couple of weeks ago. They've had a number of big banks signing up. And essentially, it starts off with the principles for green trade finance, and they're planning to move on to sustainability-linked trade, supply chain finance, and ultimately principles for social trade finance. But the big concern I have, and also the organization I work for as well, the International Trade and Forfeiting Association, is that this simply won't work in an emerging market context. Sure, if you're an international company working in Germany, USA, Japan, probably not difficult to be able to fill in all these forms, get all the information. But how does an SME in Africa actually submit the information that's required? These kind of principles require dozens and dozens of data points, and very often they just don't exist. I myself have been part of the Wave 3 consultations along with many other people, and we've repeatedly been saying, look, we support the principles, they cannot work in an African context, and this is an ongoing battle we're having. But this is one of the directions we're going in. So certainly any client that you're going to be dealing with who's looking at doing some kind of export or trade, you want to be looking at this model and thinking, how can we align? And because of this concern over this gap that we have here, and also the fact that SMEs ultimately are the ones who are very often excluded from the markets and finance, this has been a big driving factor in setting up what is called TFCOP, the Trade Finance Conference of Parties. The first meeting was held last year in Washington, DC, and really the idea is to try and bridge the gap. Because on one side, we've got the DFIs, like the IFC, the World Bank, African Development Bank. They have huge buckets of money, which is supposed to go towards things like sustainable trade finance, but they can never actually distribute it. Why? Because there's a huge gap between them and the SMEs on the other side in Africa, and they're much smaller banks. And so the idea is TFCOP brings them together and all the entities who should be in the middle. We're talking about all the commercial banks, the non-banking finance institutions, and the major facilitators, the lawyers, the ones who sit in the middle and make this happen. And the big aim of TFCOP is to halve the trade finance gap by the end of this decade and eliminate it entirely by 2040. For Africa, we're talking somewhere in the region of $1.3 billion a year, this trade finance gap. Globally, it's somewhere in the region of $4 billion. And one of the things we're doing is actually lobbying the UN to recognize the trade finance gap as a critical obstacle to achieving the SDGs, pretty much all of them as well. And so I think the important thing to understand is the regulatory landscape is shifting, but there's quite a few practical responses out there as well. The TFCOP task force has just been set up. That was set up also at the development conference in Seville a couple of weeks ago. And we actually have a working group of the Africa Regional Committee at ITFA who was working on pilots to put into there. We welcome all participation, and so I would like to do a shout out to everyone who is attending at the moment. If you're interested in getting involved in this and trying to actually help resolve this issue, this is about closing the trade finance gap and doing it with sustainable trade and sustainable trade finance. You'd be very welcome. Just look it up online. So the final point I just want to make before I finish is to say that we need to do a transition, okay? The entire economies of the world have to transition, but it must be a just transition. I give you the example here of South Africa and the South African coal fields. South Africa is very heavily dependent on coal mining, but everyone's saying you've got to go green, you've got to shut the coal mines. Well, yes, but what about all the people who depend on it? There's tens of thousands of miners. There's millions of people who depend on them. What do? Just put them out of a job and say you're done. There are social impacts that come here. And if you bear in mind that Africa is perhaps maximum 3% of global emissions, why are you saying to a country like South Africa, which has ample coal resources and a real shortages of electricity, power cuts the whole time, why are you saying to them, right, we've got to cut it out? The big issue here is to recognize that there has to be a just transition. It really is up to the developed markets of the world, who are responsible for most of the carbon in the atmosphere and global warming, to actually take most of the pain. But if we're going to have a transition, we need to think of the social impact. We can't just say blanket, we cannot do certain things. And in Africa, it's a very nuanced case. And that's why the call for a just transition is perhaps one of the key things also, which is in all of the debate about becoming more sustainable, and particularly for African business. So I'll leave it there as my opening comments, and I'm happy to answer other questions as we get into the webinar.
Thank you so much, Ted. And to your point about the social aspect of ESG, I think that's the thing that's overlooked in terms of supply chains, in terms of the human capital, in terms of what the investors are looking for. And I think the point that you touched upon about the fact the millennials and the fact that the up and coming investors, this stuff matters to them. And also the highlighting the situation about the governance structures and the importance of us as Africans on the continent and how we get involved, because a lot of the time these discussions and these things are formed without us being invited into the room. So I think that
was the big problem with the ICC principles. You know, we got furious about that, and that's why I'm very happy with TF COP, this thing we've set up.
Yeah.
The Africa group is ready to start pitching. No one else is ready. Africa is leading the way there, and the idea is going to be based on African solutions that are required for resolving African problems.
Absolutely. And that actually ties in quite nicely with Adeola, who's going to sort of explore the whole challenges of governance further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ted. And I completely agree with you. There's no better time than to start the conversation on ESG being African-led. And I would always say to you, to everyone listening, for example, you have to keep an eye on governance. What if I told you that you could be a fully compliant, legally registered company in Africa, operating entirely within the bounds of national law, and you could still lose millions overnight? You could be dropped by investors, it could go viral for the wrong reasons. And that's the world we live right now, because ESG is no longer a Western issue. ESG is here and it's personal. And today I'm going to be talking about offering legal testimony on this matter, because it's no longer optional, it's no longer aspirational, it's now existential. ESG is now both a risk and also opportunity. ESG is not our enemy. It's what puts companies at risk. And what puts companies at risk is treating ESG like it's PR or like it's just optics, instead of treating ESG as policy, instead of treating ESG as obligation. When legal stays silent, risk festers. When legal leads, ESG becomes a leverage. So it's not just a legal risk anymore, it's also now a legal strategy. It's both cross-examination, and it can punish you if you're careless, but it can also reward you extremely if you are rewarding it. It can also reward you if you are governing and looking at it. Ted mentioned a lot of things about the advantages, economic advantages of ESG. And I want to move a little bit differently from that. And I want to talk about the risk of poor governance of ESG. Because when ESG is managed reactively, what happens is that it exposes companies to lawsuits, cancelled contracts. It could even lead to reputational damage and stakeholder revolt. But when it is stewarded with legal foresight, ESG is a strategic asset. In my work across multiple African countries, what I've seen is that sometimes our legal teams are blindsided by what seems to be harmless ESG claims. A few sentences in a sustainability report, because more and more we're seeing that regulators are requiring companies to now also give sustainability reports. And sometimes what seems harmless, because you didn't look over it as legal, you just compiled everything, posted it on the website, included it in your annual reports. Those little claims can now, and even sometimes even a photo op, can now trigger sometimes activists, outreach, and even regulator queries. I'll give you an example of that and what we're seeing today. We're seeing that companies are being sued over what is called greenwashing. And that is what this can appear to be, forced labor or even environmental degradation. We're also seeing compliance pressures with ESG audits, disclosures demanded by investors, some of which Ted mentioned when he was speaking. Regulators and social media watchdogs. We're seeing more and more that people are getting involved. They're not waiting for the organizations, they're not waiting for government, and they're not waiting for the companies to be led. Instead, we're seeing that consumers are also speaking up regarding the things that they require companies to do. We're seeing shifts in regulatory standards. We're also seeing global standards that are far-reaching beyond the regions or the countries that they govern. We're seeing that CSRD standards, for example, are now being enforced through contracts across jurisdictions. And also, if you work in an organization that has a global reach, if you export, for example, you work with an organization that is involved in export, if you supply or you partner with any company that is governed by global ESG rules, your local inaction can become a global liability. So at the center of all of this, what we're seeing is the social license to operate. That social license to operate is an intangible and continuous permission granted by the public. It's not something that is issued by a regulator, but it is earned. It is earned through trust, transparency, and governance. If you lose your social license to operate, you don't just lose goodwill, you lose revenue, you could lose talent, investors, and sometimes even the ability to operate, because we're finding that more and more people are now able to call out companies and to call out boycotts for companies. In Africa, where formal ESG enforcement is still catching up, our social license has now become the first regulator, and sometimes it starts online. And that's why African companies must not simply follow ESG global rules, we must lead in defining them. African companies, governments, legal practitioners must shape ESG frameworks that reflect our realities, our history, and our priorities. ESG is not, in Africa, cannot just be copy and paste, it must be context-driven, locally anchored, and globally respected. What happens if you ignore the E or the S or the G, or God forbid, you ignore all three? I'll give 4 case testimonies across different regions. First one will be something that happened recently in South Africa. Total Energies and fan packs in South Africa in August 2024. The South African Advertising Regulatory Board, the ARB, ruled that Total Energies misled the public by claiming sustainability in spite of its ongoing fossil fuel expansion. As you can see in that short case, there's the E and there's the G. The E was misrepresentation of impact. So it wasn't as if Total Energy was at the moment doing anything particularly to harm the parks, but it was that it had a global strategy that was still drilling fossil fuel. And because of that, an organization, an NGO, took them to court that they then were advertising that they were sustainable. And also there's a G in that, because obviously if somebody had looked at this internally, they might have picked up that this is something that someone might have an issue with. So it's always good to ensure that you're looking over what it is, the documents that are being sent out, whether it's in your sustainability reports, in your marketing campaigns, and all of those things, because those are the things that we're now seeing are important and are being flagged, not just by regulators, but even also by people. And now we'll look at something on community engagement. In Kenya, there was a particular case, Lamu, Save Lamu, that's what it's called, and Amo Power. What happened was the license for Amo Power was revoked because an NGO complained and the community came up in strong support for that, that they didn't have adequate public consultation before the coal plant project started. And in that case, we see very clearly three different ESG, the S, and the G that was ignored by Amo Power, which led to its license being revoked. Again, the license being revoked started by someone completely out of their industry, and it started by an online petition that was then picked up by the NGO. So again, they ignored the E, which is the environmental impact assessment. They ignored community voices because apparently the community had been going to protests, but they were ignored. And then lastly, of course, there was the governance breakdown within the organizations. So you must always engage your stakeholders early, document your consultations, and ensure that you're involved in all kinds of documentation within the organization. Now let's move to if, for example, you supply and you're in supply chain. In DRC, there was a cobalt litigation, and that litigation started in 2019 and didn't end until 2024. Now, this was a particularly interesting one because the organization that sued was an organization that sued from Africa, and it sued the global organizations like Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, and others. It claimed that they were aiding and abetting their suppliers to use child labor in Congo and in the Congolese cobalt supply chains. Now, in that particular case, what had happened was they had so many defendants, and they were all less than 17. They all came forward to explain in different ways how they had been impacted by what was going on. Well, although Apple, Tesla, Microsoft all said that all they did was buy, they were just purchasing, they were not involved, they were impacted, even online, by people bashing them. They did win that particular case, both at the Federal Circuit Court in the US and also in the appeal courts. But that reputational damage is something that persists. And there are people who till now are not happy and will not purchase anything that relates to any of these organizations. So they had the issues with the human rights violations, with even supplier oversights and those failures. So we have to be looking out for those. And there's been the online boycotts of different organizations, even ones in Nigeria as well, where organizations have been asked to boycott because of different issues, ranging from personal issues of staff, of directors, of the board, to issues that the organizations have done. So how do we shift from exposure to strategic advantage? One of the first things that we must do as legal counsel is to ensure that there are no claims that we go to press with that we don't have proof for. So if it's not something that will stand the test in court, you should not be including it in anything that you're releasing, whether it's online, whether it's your annual reports, any of those. You should be looking over your ESG disclosures. What are you doing when it comes to the environment? How is it impacting the communities that you work with? What are you doing with your staff, with your people? There are so many examples of organizations who have been impacted by staff who were unhappy, who went online and said disparaging things about the organizations. The Gen Zs, part of what Ted mentioned when he was giving his opening remarks, is they will go online and they will not work for an organization that has a bad report online. People will check your organization, even you as a person online, before they trust you to do business with you. So your social license to operate has now become even more critical than your regulatory license to operate. You must also be building legal comms approval processes in everything that you do. Your legal team must not be outside of the room when these communications are being developed. You must have contractual control and make sure that you've embedded ESG in not just at the end of the fence, but through all of your contracts. Who are your suppliers? Have you looked at what they do? Have you asked them what they do? You need to be looking at that. You should have standard ESG clauses. If you don't have that, you should start looking at that. And of course, absolutely, without fail, you must be doing due diligence of all the partners that you work with now. ESG is not such that you can take reactively, it's now something that you must proactively take control of. And governance will always start in the boardroom. Without governance, ESG is just good intentions. You must have quarterly briefings with your board on those things, and also record your board decisions and your risk reviews. You must be reviewing what the risk for the organization is. Lawyers are no longer required to just be simply advisors. We're now also compliance and risk analysts as well. And your community's silence is not approval. It could be a lawsuit waiting to happen. So do not just let your colleagues say nobody's complaining and take that as a reason why we should continue business as usual. Use social listening tools as well and respond when people start to complain. Document everything, because intent is never enough, not now. And your evidence would always be the proof of your actions. Your best defense is the people trail that you are building today. So have your decision logs and make sure that you're reviewing everything that goes out before it goes out. As African GCs, we can't be waiting for ESG regulation to come knocking. We must be anticipating those questions regulators haven't asked yet. We must be seeing those lawsuits before they land on our desk. When you're looking at documents, when you're looking at operations generally, take your operations from the beginning till the end and review what you have in your operations. At what stage and who is being impacted? Who are your stakeholders? Whose interests should be protected at this stage? Who should be informed at this stage? Make sure that you're informing those that need to be informed. Make sure you're carrying along those that need to be carried along, and make sure that you're doing your stakeholder mapping accurately, just so that we don't say that. I've seen reports and certain meetings, had conversations where lawyers say that this is just simply CSR, but it's not, because that thing that you consider just CSR, sometimes you find that you're writing an apology letter, or worse, defending your company in courts. So the gap is not just about legal ignorance or legal estimation. It's simply that you cannot afford it, not anymore. So here's the truth. No one is going to build Africans' ESG narrative for us. We will have to do it ourselves. It's not going to be based on what we've been handed over. It's not going to be based on just regulation, at least not in Africa, but it's going to be based on the frameworks that we are putting in place, the governance structures that we're putting in place, not just in our boardrooms, but also across our executive teams. So it's our opportunity to also embed African values into ESG. I've always said that I believe that ESG started in Africa. The concept of Ubuntu is not something that was taught to us. It's the concept of stewardship, equality, and resilience. And we must insist that these are values that show through in the operations of our organizations. So ESG is not a trend. It's the terrain that we work with now. It's in your contract, it's in your marketing messaging, it's in your supplier agreement, your stakeholder meetings. When you govern it well, it will protect you. You do it poorly, it will prosecute you. So we're not just defending our organizations now, we're defining them. That'll be my opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adeola. That was really helpful and insightful. And I think that consistent theme of diligence and the fact that as lawyers, we should be looking at all aspects of diligence, our supply chains, our contracts, what we're doing in terms of disclosure, communications. I think there is sometimes a sentiment that ESG is light and fluffy and it's a nice to have. And actually, to your point, this is strategy, and the risk of not taking it seriously can lead you into very difficult places. And actually, the point that you made about community engagement, I think, is very key, especially when you're looking at global organizations. And even if you are based on the continent, if you do work for a global organization, you really do have to think about that, the reach and implications of what it does. So thank you for that. And actually, I think we can stop here just to check if we do have any questions for Ted and Adeola. I can't see the questions.
There are actually questions in the Q&A if you click on that button. I think the first one was for me. I can answer that. And then there's one
Sure.
as well. There was a question here about ESG regulations from Europe affecting trade in Africa, and just basically saying, can we use our own regulations? Why do we necessarily have to use the regulations from other countries? And that's a very good point. That's one of the things which is behind TFCOP as well, and part of the reason we've been pushing back against these ICC principles for sustainable trade, because they all make sense on paper, but they absolutely don't work in an African context. So to give you one example of, I think, how this can work quite well in terms of an African pushback, I'm also working on a project which is sponsored by the International Cocoa Organization to create an Africa Cocoa Exchange. The idea is to bring pricing power back to Africa, bring a lot more benefits for farmers, cooperatives, local processors. But my part of the project, I'm part of a team, is looking at the financing, but also everything around sustainability and traceability. And we decided very early on that the standard we're going to use for sustainability is ARS 1000. That was developed by Africa. The 4 largest African producers, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, under the aegis of the ICCO. But it's very clearly an African standard. It's absolutely compatible with all the other standards out there, whether it's Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, EUDR, whatever you want to call it. But the important thing is it was designed in the African context, therefore it can be owned by the Africans. And to give you one example, the way they look at children working on farms, there is a real difference between child labor and child work. If you are the child of a farmer anywhere in the world, you're going to be working on the farm at some point. The question is, what are the conditions? And it really comes down to 3 things. Number one, are the children actually the children of the farmer? They haven't been trafficked in from somewhere else. You don't want to allow that. Number two, are the children involved in appropriate work? If you go to any cooperatives, you'll see big paintings on the outside saying, under the age of 14, no one using machetes. Under the age of 16, no one using pesticides. Under the age of 18, no one driving tractors. You know, that's dangerous work. But 3, and most importantly, are they going to school? Right? Are they attending school? I was really impressed the first time I went out to cocoa country in Cote d'Ivoire. We left from Abidjan very early in the morning to avoid the traffic. And when we got to the cocoa region, there were literally thousands of children walking along the sides of the road, all going to school. Every farmer wants their kid to go to school and do better in life. But they're not going to do that if the nearest school is 20 miles away. So I think the important point here is that if you can establish that actually these are the children, they're doing appropriate work, they are getting schooling, then that's child work, right? But if it's not, it's child labor. And that's what we want to stamp out. And I think that's an important thing to understand. If you can have regulations and frameworks which work in the African context, then they actually bring good. Because if you get some European companies saying, we will not touch anything where children have worked on it, you're probably not going to be able to import anything at all.
Yeah, very fundamental. Are there any other questions? I can't access it on my screen. So
there's one here from Anonymous to Adeola. It says, when you say ESG clauses should be included, please could you clarify what you have in mind?
Yes. Thank you, Ted. So ESG clauses are contractual provisions that help to define how and limit behavior, also maybe even moderate behavior that relates to sustainability, ethics, to labor, human rights. Those kind of clauses are the clauses that I mean. And they're important to include, whether you're an SME or multinational, to include those clauses in your contract. So for example, you could have a clause that talks about environment. For example, how do you dispose of waste? If, for example, your supplier disposes of waste, how do they dispose of waste? So if, for example, you're getting an organization to build for you, for example, say you're in the building industry, how are they disposing of the waste? Who are the people that they're employing? What are the safety standards that they give to their staff? You know, those are some of the things that could tell. Are you putting in your clauses, for example, the kind of lighting that you would like to have in the building? Those are some of the things that you could have. You could also have a supplier contract that mandates, for example, emissions, for example, water use. You know, those are some of the clauses that I mean. You could say that your company reserves a right to audit or to terminate the contract if there are environmental violations, or if the employ child labor. And of course, like Ted said, I understand how child labor is very different in Africa, very different, but in putting those guardrails. So you're not stifling them or suffocating them by saying that they cannot have anyone, but putting those guardrails, some of the things that Ted said. So making sure that they're not endangered when they're working in the organization. You could decide that you want to ask them to maintain a particular ISO standard for environments. It could be that you insist on equal pay, that they show you that they have an equity policy within their organization, or that they engage the communities that they work on if it's for large projects. If it's, for example, in oil and gas, what guardrails do they have in place for spills or anything like that, for safely transporting? What guardrails do they have in place? You also want to include ESG clauses that talk about that provide for warranties, for example. So how do they warrant the operations that they work with, that they provide to you? So how do you, when you discover what happened at that time, how are you enforcing anti-bribery, for example, and corruption controls? Those are all ESG clauses that you could put in your contract. It's just to make sure that those clauses are there and you know why you put them there. Whistleblowing is another very easy one that a lot of people overlook, but should also be in your contract clauses so that people are able to come up to you and even to them to talk about these issues. Because when a whistleblower's alert is responded to on time, it can save reputational damage in future. So those are some of the clauses that I mean when I say that. So it's warranties, it's undertakings, is in the requirements on how the work is in their reporting obligations, it's in their audits, your right to audit their work, and also termination triggers. So those are some of the clauses. When I say ESG clauses, those are the things that I mean.
Thank you so much. I'm mindful of time, so perhaps we can take more questions at the end. But in order to sort of give you, the audience, a flavour as to what you should be looking out for and what sort of things you should consider, we're going to go into some sort of case scenarios. And the first dilemma that I want to present to you is conflicting headquarters versus local law. So our global headquarters requires ESG disclosures based on EU frameworks. Local law doesn't. Our CEO says we should avoid inviting unnecessary scrutiny, and legal is caught in the middle, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with this situation. So what would you advise? A, follow HQ guidance and go beyond local law. B, comply with local law only. Or C, recommend phase ESG disclosures. Now, I'm hoping I can see the poll on my screen.
Yeah, I think it's up now, isn't it?
It's up. Great, fantastic, great. So
everyone's just voting at the moment.
Yeah, we'll give it a minute. Okay, I've given it a moment, and it seems to me that A is the... Oh.
If you want, I can just poll and share the results, if that's okay. I'll do that. There you are.
Yeah, it's still changing though. So actually, let's just end it at this stage. It's 64% for A. I wonder if Ted or Adeola, either of you, want to sort of discuss this. This to me would have been my preference as well, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on the fact that we've gone for A as the majority.
Maybe I'll let the lawyer go first. So if I'm going to be practical, I would say that my approach would be C, actually. I would say disclosure. Why do I say that? Because I work with a lot of African companies, and I know that we have more small-scale organizations than we have the large organizations. And I know that if you're just starting out building ESG into your your corporate strategy, it might seem like a lot to the founders, to the shareholders, and to stakeholders generally. It might just seem like a lot. You will get a pushback if you just want to start immediately. So I'd say phase disclosure, comply locally, but also start to plan globally and start to document those decisions and have a timeline for when you're doing, when you're taking actions all the time to start to comply. And have your risk mapping and look at what it is that are the critical things that you need to comply with immediately. Start to comply with those immediately, and then start to build on those. Make sure that your strategy shows the intent and to protect your license, especially the social license to operate that I mentioned. So that would always be my strategy from a practical point of view.
Yeah. I don't know if Ted, if you wanted to add to that.
I would very much agree. And I think basically just to get back to one point you made there, which is just this whole point about that you need to show that you're on a journey with the regulators. So if, for example, the EU is demanding all these things, you can't possibly do everything at once. But what you don't want to do is get into a situation where someone says, oh, we've discovered this problem, this kind of scrutiny, which the CEO didn't want. What you don't want to say is, oh, that's a subsidiary, it's not our problem.
Yeah.
Wrong answer. Or, well, we were planning to do something about it. Much better if you say, this is our program. We're already disclosing this. We know, we've focused on these are, let's say, the 3 issues we know are most relevant to us. And look what we've done. That's the most important. And ultimately, no regulator is really going to fine you or sanction you if you're in the process of trying to do something. But they will sanction you if you've done nothing or you've just made vague commitments, like it's our intention to be more sustainable. Sustainability is the heart of our operations, but you've done nothing. So I think this idea of phased, realistic disclosures makes sense, and it's sending the right message to the market, and it gives you time to address maybe some of the issues that you don't want to start disclosing yet because you need to do some work on them first.
Yeah, and I was also add to that, and following the HQ guidance, I think if you're a part of an organization that is global, although you may not locally be able to follow what your global organization is doing, I think it's important that you set those standards. And to the extent that those can't be met, of course, you can discuss and you can explain it. But I think not to sort of consider it would put your global organization at risk. And this is all about managing risk and reputation. So definitely phased, but do consider and have answers to when the regulator comes knocking. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the second dilemma, which is the supplier risk in a high value contract. So one of our top suppliers is under fire from NGOs for poor environmental practices. No direct breach on our side. Leadership wants to go ahead quietly. So A, enforce, clarify ESG clause before signing. B, proceed but flag future improvements. Or C, raise concerns but defer to the business. Oh, 100% B. Sorry, I should know by now that these polls keep changing. I'm going to stay quiet for a bit. Okay, I'm going to end the poll here. And it seems that we've gone, thank you, for 47%, which is A. Any thoughts from either of you on the decision for A?
I'm going to say that I completely agree with this one. This time around, 100%. You should definitely activate the ESG clauses. I think Ted and I have gone over some of these as well when we spoke. So have audit clauses, remediate clauses, because silence can obviously equal complicit, that you're complicit as well, and a complicit risk. This is something you definitely want to avoid. So I'm going to be saying A, of course.
Yeah.
I would agree, because I think it's this whole thing about
Essentially.
once you know, then anything that you did to overlook it ultimately is you're being you're collaborating in this. A classic example
Mm,
where this went very bad was actually for Boohoo in the United Kingdom, because
yeah.
they got done a few years ago because they actually had a factory in Leicester. A lot of people who working there were immigrants, but they were being paid less than the legal minimum wage. That is
Yeah.
illegal, and the senior management knew and said, let's just not talk about it. We're making good money.
Yeah.
So by doing that, not only have they really, really suffered, but also their share price has been utterly clobbered and never
Mhm.
recovered. So I think
Yeah.
the point is, once you know, I don't think you have any other choice. Yeah.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And even if you don't know, ignorance is no defense. If you're reducing products and you are not looking at your supply chains and what happens there, you can't in any way expect people to be sympathetic or support what you're doing. Okay, let's move on to the third dilemma, which is greenwashing pressure. So we've launched an ESG report full of optimistic claims. Now I'm under pressure to approve marketing that feels misleading. The ESG team says everyone does it. What would you do as legal? Request evidence to support all claims, approve with disclaimers, or escalate as a reputational risk? Okay, I'm going to end the poll here, and it seems we request evidence to support all claims. And given Adeola, the discussion that you raised in your arguments about evidence and making sure you substantiate comments, things like your annual reports, websites, communications, anything that you do, I think everyone's been listening very carefully. So I'm not sure if there's anything more you need to impress on us in relation to that.
No, I don't think so. And I'm so pleased that, almost everyone agrees with this particular one because, it's absolutely important that we're not caught greenwashing the reputational risk and how it affects economic risk as well is a huge, huge reality that everyone has to be aware of. So I'm glad that they're listening.
Yeah.
Ted
Just on
has
that point,
more.
I think
Yeah.
the other big danger in there as well, it's not just greenwashing, it's what I would call green wishing. Where
I like that one. I'll use that one.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you make these vague comments, it is our
Yeah.
intention to be greener by, or someone says we will be fully green by 27.
Mm,
You look at them and be like, you'll be dead by then. You really think
yeah.
you're going to be held to account for that? It really doesn't
Yeah.
help in that kind of sense. So I think the
Okay.
greenwashing, the vagueness, things that that are not really tangible or whatever, that is actually almost as dangerous as basically claiming something is, let's say, good for your health and it's not, or good for the environment. So absolutely, I would agree. Request the evidence, and if the evidence is not there, don't make the claim.
Yeah, and I think the problem is that organizations are very zealous. They want to show how great they are. So there's a very fine line between sort of writing things that are really inaccurate, but you're trying to enhance the brand. And you've got to really consider, how do you support that? What does that really look like? And to the point that's been made, are we washing or are we wishing things instead of actually evidencing that? Thank you for responding to those three dilemmas. I think the audience is listening. I think the audience is learning. And I think the audience is very much kind of processing all the things that have been discussed. So let's move on to the final poll. In your view, is ESG primarily a legal risk or a strategic opportunity for African companies? A, legal risks, a strategic opportunity, or both equally? I'm going to end the poll here, and I think it's unanimous that we think of that we agree that it is both equally. But of course, I will open the floor to Adeola and Ted just to discuss a little bit further.
Yeah, I think we did go over this, Ted and I, and I think that I actually even said a little bit about this when I was making my opening comments. So it is both actually, and it just depends on what the organization's, how the organization has been working with ESG, how they've been looking at their ESG risk, and whether they've treated it as some pretty thing to have, some nice to have, or if they've actually been working on it. So it's an opportunity. It's also a risk depending on how the organization has been interacting with it.
Yeah. Just to add to that as well, if you think of how the ISC talks about it, they used to talk about climate risk. They talk about climate opportunity now, because it's all about climate finance. So I often think of that thing that they say about Chinese. The Chinese word for crisis is two characters. One character is danger, the other is opportunity. That's it. They're both exactly the same thing, because there's a huge opportunity for financing out there. Financing to enable a client to become greener and more sustainable. And then at the end of it, you can continue financing them as well. So it's an enormous opportunity, but it is a colossal risk exactly at the same time. And if you don't seize the opportunity, as Adeola was saying, sometimes the reputational risk can be existential. It can completely wipe out your company.
Yeah. And I just wanted to sort of add to that. I honestly think that the African continent is so rife with opportunities in terms of ESG. We've got a very young population. I think there's the stats is something like by 2030, 40% of the global youth in Africa will be in Africa. So there's real opportunity for the youth. There's real opportunity for innovation. There's real opportunity for growth. And obviously we've got the resources, right? And of course, there's the good side of having the resources, and there's the disadvantage of having the resources, and whatever that looks like. And so I think the opportunities are just vast, and it really depends on how the organization frames it and the risk and the way they manage it. I'm quite excited by this. I just think to the point that we've discussed about governance and regulations and being in the room, we need to consider this. So to finally conclude, I will check actually if we do have any further questions.
We do.
Been
trying to see how to respond to them as we're going on. So yeah.
Okay. If you could perhaps take them, so I can't see them on my screen. So
I think I've answered a particular one.
There was one on there I saw slightly earlier, just if I can make a comment on it. It was someone saying that we're talking a lot about commodities and extractive industries, but what about, for example, if you are involved in pensions or pension funds or something like that? And it's an interesting point, because you're several steps away from where the ESG impacts are occurring. And you could say, what does this have to do with us? But actually, probably if you're involved in pension funds, you probably have a bigger impact than anyone at all out there, because you ultimately are the financing for these companies. A few years ago, I was involved in a project with Lloyd's Banking Group, who are really seriously taking ESG, literally root and branch. Now, Lloyd's is huge. They own Scottish Widows in the UK as well. So I think they're sitting on something like 14% of assets in the UK. They've got to be very careful what they say to the market, because they're systemically important. They can shift the market. And actually one of the most difficult areas for them is everything about pension investments. But if you think about it, if you're a pension fund, you want to be seeing long-term stable returns. You're not interested in the pension fund and we made a lot of money, then we lost a lot of money. Absolutely not. Therefore, you want sustainable investments. And so there are a number of tools out there. I think of the PACTA tool that was developed by the Paris Agreement. And essentially what you do is you would take all of your assets, and essentially it will say, this is the carbon footprint of your assets. These assets are above the level that you should be acceptable. These are below. And that enables you to say, well, with these particular assets, they might be, let's say, an oil company, a mine or something like that. Okay, either we need to find ways to mitigate that impact, or actually over time, we need to move out of those assets into greener assets or more socially and environmentally stable assets as well. So I think actually it's critically important that the actual lever of power comes from a lot of pension funds to make change. So I think it's very much about looking at what is the asset base and where are the main kind of exposures you have, and then use your power as a major financier to make change.
And to add to that, I also try to give a few pointers, because what I realize is that because the organizations and the boards don't see the correlation between ESG and the operations that they run, it might be even difficult to start that conversation in the boardroom, not to talk about bringing it into strategy like Ted has said, and first even get them to understand why it's important. And so what I've done and mentioned to you, the person who asked the question, is to start by even showing your board that you're probably already doing a little bit of ESG already. So bring forth those things that you're already doing. For example, you probably have a policy on equity when it comes to recruitment. Your DEI policy is probably something that you already have. So look at that. Look at what you're doing with your carbon footprint. So how much are people traveling? Are they traveling a lot, or can you substitute that? Look at what you're doing with your light, with water use and all of that. Present that to the board. If you're not doing that, start with doing those. Share those quick wins with them and show them the importance and how you're benefiting from that. Once you do that, they see the figures, which is what they understand in the boardroom. Figures. It's always about figures. Once you see that and you can convince them of that, then you can start the bigger conversation about incorporating ESG into strategy. And then, of course, you can start to share with them some of the things that Ted's mentioned of how you can even use that to leverage and to get even more financing. So I hope this helps.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before we wrap up?
There's a question also on energy companies. If an energy company serving in an African country that is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, would you say that adaptation to a just transition is easy? And if not, what will be your proposals aligning with ESG? I think that one is probably for Ted, I think, but I'll be happy to jump in afterwards. So Ted.
Sure. No, absolutely. No, I think the whole thing for an energy company is that you have to have a transition program, and you've got to understand. So first of all, that means you need to understand what is your carbon footprint. Okay, so scope 1 and scope 2 at the very least, what you're directly doing and in terms of your operations. Scope 3 is a bit more complicated, but if you are basically an energy company, you've got to understand what are the emissions that are going out into the world because of that. And in fact, in the long term, you need to become net zero. Now, it might be that that's not an option for the next 10 years. That's fine, but you have to be on a journey to do that. So I think the thing is an honest assessment of where you are. Set a baseline, right? It's a bit like that dilemma we had where the CEO was like, no, we don't want scrutiny. Well, it has to start at some point. You have to say, this is where we are. This is where we want to get to. I think that's the most important thing. But certainly as an energy company, you have to be looking towards becoming net zero eventually. And there are multiple ways to do that. There are lots of ways to diversify. There are ways to offset emissions as well. But what you can't do is take the Trump approach, drill, baby, drill.
And realizing that, this is also sort of a political debate right now. And I know that organizations and governments are involved in this. So if you went to your board and said, we have to move immediately, it definitely won't happen. And yes, the answer to your question is it won't be easy. So it would have to be a phased approach, something that you will do. Start again by documenting what you already do and have a plan as to how to transit. If you look at what Total is doing, Total has moved from a lot of focus on energy to now renewable energy. So they're talking solar, they're financing all sorts of different programs. So that might be something that you need to look at, because the truth is eventually this will happen because more and more people are against fossil fuels and the dangers, even though we also have a lot of, companies in Africa and African governments relying on that. So that struggle is still going to be there. It's not going to be easy, but you should have a plan. Don't go into the next couple of years without a plan on this.
Yeah. There is, by the way, just one other question, which was asking about, are there any credible ESG courses? If I could just put in a plug, I actually do a course. I'm doing one in October, which is on how you integrate ESG risk into finance. So if you're interested, I'm just popping in the chat the link again. But I think there are various other ones. I don't know if Adeola, you do any courses yourself as well.
Yes, there's one from Cambridge that they do that is good. And there are free courses also that you can find online. I don't want to put forth a lot of that because I simply just think that out of respect for Ted, we should just, support Ted.
Thank you. That's fine. Well, maybe I'll get you in as a speaker, Adeola, on the course. Yeah.
Please.
But how I'm doing it very much unpacks a lot of the things that we've been discussing today. And a lot of it, there's quite a few case studies in there as well. So certainly of interest. But I think exactly what you mentioned as well, Adeola, Cambridge and the Cambridge Centre for Sustainable Leadership as well. They run quite a number of courses. I've taught on some of those as well.
Yeah, I was going to advocate the Cambridge course as well. But of course, yes, Ted, now that we know about your course, that's obviously something that we should consider first. So, yeah, and they're worth doing.
Yes, I'm sure Ted is going to be looking at it from the African angle, which needs to be more practical than what it is that we're getting from outside. So absolutely. I'm advocating Ted's course.
Yeah, and I also think by taking a course, it starts with the fundamentals, but it really drills into the basics and it just allows you to kind of build on that knowledge. So thank you. I think we can sort of come to our concluding remarks, and just to keep them brief, I think we've been quite thorough in the discussion, and I see that the conclusion is that it's equal. Legal risks and a strategic opportunity, we should view them equally. They're inextricably linked, and one or is the reverse of the other, or the reverse or the other impacts the other. They're all influenced quite closely. So I'll just hand over to Ted just to finally sort of share his last thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think you said very early on in the webinar, is it a liability or an opportunity? And we know it's absolutely both in that sense. Mm-hmm. I think actually if I could slightly change something that you said, Adeola, as well, you're saying it's no longer aspirational, this is existential. It's also about compliance. So I think the bottom line is however you feel, even if you want to be a good person, that's great. And we should be good and we should be sustainable. But the bottom line is this is about compliance, okay, right? If you are not, you will be out of business. So the key thing here is to get on with it. Have a look at what is relevant to you, to your clients, the business you're doing. There are a million ESG risks out there, but there will be certain ones which are very relevant. Understand them, quantify them, and do something about it and have a plan. Because then, God forbid, if there is a reputational issue or an issue from a regulator, you can show you're doing something about it. And the consumers out there today really care about that. If they can see you're doing something, they will give you that benefit of the doubt. If they feel you're trying to cover it up, you're going to have an existential crisis.
And Adeola?
I would say that ESG does not respect borders. You should know that now. The risk is not what the law says today, but it's in what the market will demand, not just today, but also tomorrow. So you need to treat ESG not just as a soft policy issue, but make sure that you have strong language that can help to prevent and de-escalate legal crises. Use ESG not just as paperwork, because it can sometimes even be your defensive shield. You will find more and more organizations are leaning into companies that they find as sustainable. It's no longer a buzzword. It's now something that we now have to do. Don't ignore the communities that you work with and online backlash, because those are real. It can come from any area. It can come from everywhere. Your social license to operate, guard that with everything. Thank you.
And just to top that, I do think that ESG is the future. It impacts everything that we do. We are businesses, and businesses are based on people, and people interact with the environment. So as lawyers really consider the risk, the due diligence, the communications, the reputational aspect of what your organization is doing, I think I can agree with both Ted and Adeola that the compliance and the governance is critical. Let's be in the room. Let's shape the policies that will drive this, because it will impact us. And it may even impact Africa disproportionately, given natural resources and the way our cultures are run. Thank you, Ted, And thank you, Adeola, for your contributions. I found this insightful, and I hope the audience has too. This is the first webinar, as Karen alluded to, and there will be another one to follow, and I'm sure those details will be shared. But have a good afternoon or a good evening, and it's been a pleasure to have moderated this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you for a very powerful session. Thank you to the community for joining us today, and for your participation with the polls and your questions. Always wonderful to have something interactive. From ACGC's perspective, we are firmly focused on plans for our annual conference in Livingstone, Zambia, which is taking place from the 1st to the 3rd of October. Registration is open and available on the ACGC website. I urge you please to go and secure your spot. Early bird bookings are available and open. Obviously, you can get yourself a discount by securing those tickets. Thank you again to everybody for making today's session such a success. We look forward to more insightful conversations in the months ahead, and we look forward to seeing some of you in Zambia in October. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.